these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Now, we all remember, and I don't know how we could forget, the images that came out of Afghanistan as the government collapsed ahead of our withdrawal. The chaos at the airport, with Afghans clinging to U.S. cargo planes, some falling to their death, were a microcosm of the larger withdrawal and even the way we managed the war itself. But as the world watched, others acted. They saw what was happening. They knew that we were breaking tens of thousands of promises we made to our Afghan allies who fought beside us, enabled us, and assisted us. These men and women couldn't just stand by and watch. They got involved. But it wasn't that easy. They couldn't just get Afghans out by sheer will. They had to design and establish networks. They basically had to build the plane while they were flying it. They relied on old contacts who might know someone to develop a system to do what was right and try to uphold the promises we made over almost 20 years in Afghanistan. And here today to tell us about that effort is Lieutenant Colonel, retired Scott Mann, who founded Task Force Pineapple, loose affiliation of veterans and citizens who work to exfiltrate Afghans and the U.S. Citizens that were left. Scott is a retired Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel, author, and business owner. Scott, thanks for being on. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks for having me on, Congressman. I appreciate it.
So there's a lot of places we could start. Kind of want to know how the idea for Pineapple Express started. Why is it called Pineapple Express? This is a question I personally have always had.
Yeah. So it was, I'd love to tell you that there was like some kind of thought that went into the naming convention or something like some of the task forces that you and I served, but it wasn't that at all. In fact, I could probably answer both questions with the simple fact that it was a friend who reached out to me in a time of duress and asked for help. That simple. And there was no plan. I'd been retired for 10 years. I'd moved away from the Afghanistan piece and had, moved on with my life in a different direction. And so there, putting this thing together was completely ad hoc. It was completely unexpected. And to be quite honest with you, it wasn't something I wanted to do. I didn't like where things had gone in Afghanistan and had left Special Forces for that reason. Mm-hmm. So getting back involved with it, certainly back involved with the government on it again, was the last thing in my retirement plan. But when Nizam called, a former Afghan commando, and it was just clear that nobody else was coming. You talk about your no plan B. I mean, that was it. That was very obvious that there was nobody else coming. There was nobody else going to do anything. So it just became an effort at a local level to try to help him with some SF buddies. The name Pineapple came about when he got right up to the edge of the perimeter and the Marines were about to toss him out. And we had one Hail Mary call to make, and it was to a diplomat on the inside. We told the story of Nizam in like 3 minutes of how he had been shot through the face alongside USSF, how he had gone to our Q course, and that he's about to get tossed. And the dude just paused and he goes, I was a Green Beret before I was a diplomat. The word, tell your boy to say pineapple and they'll let him stay in. That was a password that he had passed on. So we're like screaming it down to him to say it. And that became the naming convention for what we did from that point on.
That's actually that's a much cooler background to the name than I was expecting. I like that. It was a bona fides that was just ad hoc, just on the fly.
Fly.
And so that kind of that exposes a little bit of what it meant to quote unquote get people out of Afghanistan. So that's what everybody was saying at the time, just over a year ago. Everybody's like, we're getting people out. I don't think I kind of understood what that meant, but I don't think the American people just in general understood what it meant. It's nobody knows how to visualize what happens in Afghanistan or what kind of operations we did there. A lot of it's military speak. And so I do want to illuminate what that means to get people out. And, is it because I think some people might think in their heads, it's like Special Forces guys popping out of an airplane or a helicopter, right, like nabbing some people that, they're some of our friends, like literally getting them out. It's not quite like that, right? So Walk
Right.
us through like kind of how it started. It started with moments like this where like you still have their old phone numbers. So
Yeah.
you know and you're getting all these veterans together who still have some of these contacts available, and like, let's all get into one room, basically an operations center, and just start making calls and see what we can make happen.
It really was, and it's kind of funny. You what you said is because like when this first happened, I had people coming up to me going, "Dude, I'm so proud of you for going back over there." And I'm like, I didn't go back over there. I'm a 53-year-old retired storyteller. Like, I'm not a number one draft pick for personnel extraction, you know, and that's where I found myself in all this was I kept asking, where the hell is SOF? Like, why isn't SOF being unleashed on this? Like, there's no way we're going to leave our commandos and our Afghan special forces, our partners, in a lurch like this. That's not what we do. It's not going to happen. And that's what a lot of us in the veteran community, at least the special ops community, were saying to ourselves is it hasn't manifested yet. It's going to happen. They're going to be coming. So how do we just keep this thing warm until we can responsibly hand it over? Because there's no way that we're going to, A, leave the commandos on the battlefield to fend for themselves, and B, that we should be the ones messing with that. That's an Uncle Sam size problem right there. Right. But then, Congressman, what started to happen was over, you know, from really the 15th of August when the collapse in Kabul happened, it was all through the lens of Nizam, my friend, and it became very clear he is screwed. He is on his own. Whatever happens, one, the Taliban are going to kill him because he's been hunting Taliban for 11 years. And it was very clear that retribution on our commandos was going to be swift. So
can I clarify for the audience what commandos means? So commandos is a special unit within the Afghan army that mostly guys like us worked with, SEALs and Green Berets. Those were generally our partner forces.
That's right. It was our most elite partner force and really the guys that did the bulk of the fighting towards the end of the war. And for that reason, there was a very, very high stake on their heads once the city fell to the Taliban. So they were on the run almost immediately. You know, to clarify what means getting people out, you're talking about a very, very small contingent of Afghans who, the minute the Taliban went into the Ministry of Defense, they had the home addresses of where these guys lived, and they started going there. You know, so retribution was swift.
Oh yeah, I bet. And so, but we did get Nizam out, and he managed to get to the gates. And what else did you guys do? So a large part of it, and I know, like, you know, my office staff, I have some veterans, or at least one veteran who was working on this extensively at all hours of the night. And you know, the best we could do was really, okay, we'd get feedback from mostly my own veteran network that reached out. And they were like, who do we call? And so we would all we really had still was sort of the official lines that the State Department took way too long to set up. And, you know, we would get them and coordinate their entry to certain gates at Kabul airport. I also happen to have some SEAL friends who were actually on the ground there. They happened to be on that particular deployment. And we're dealing with this firsthand. So we had some contacts, but that was just to get to the gates. I mean, there was other efforts though. I think you guys were working on too. If they couldn't get to Kabul, putting them through what we call rat lines in the special operations jargon, all over the country and over borders. So maybe talk about that.
Yeah. So I mean, again, what started, I think, and it was across the board with a lot of people who had friends that were in the Afghan special ops or other areas, interpreters, was to try to help one person. And then once we met some level of success on that, what happened was in the signal chat rooms where most people were operating, you know, old friends of mine like Jay Redmond, you know, from the SEALs contacted me, and he's like, hey, I'm working these cases. What are you working? And then we started to see the value in opening the aperture and widening that soda straw so that we built these rooms in Signal where all of these veterans started coming in there, and they started naming themselves Dunkirk, Sacred Promise, Team America. I mean, like, you know, and it was mostly volunteers that were trying to play a responsible role. Here's the role that pretty much evolved with most of these groups, including ours, was when if you think about the several thousand men and women that were on the perimeter facing out, looking at this, sea of humanity, trying to hold up certificates and babies and everything else to get in, they didn't know who these people were. And they could not distinguish for the most part who was vetted and who wasn't. But these volunteer groups, these veterans, we knew who the at-risk people were. We knew where they were. And there was a level of pre-existing trust that we could move these individuals to positions of handover. And that was what we focused on with Pineapple. We built kind of an underground railroad, really, that allowed us to take our commando partners, our SF partners, and we had a connection, Congressman, on the other side of the wire with a company commander and first sergeant from the 82nd Airborne that we had met through just trying to help a pregnant female in a 4-foot hole in the fence. That's what it came down to. And we put together kind of a link-up mechanism that started on the outskirts of the crowd that just moved these individuals up through the sewage canal into that 4-foot hole where bona fides were then exchanged. They had a baseball card they were looking at of the commando and his family. They would verify it and they would pull them through that hole. And then the 82nd guys had a really good process to bypass all the bureaucracy and get them on a plane. That was our mechanism that we called the Pineapple Express.
Really? How many people do you think you saved moving through that?
You know how that goes, but I think it was, our best estimate was somewhere between 500 and 750 people during the initial collapse of the airfield up until the ISIS-K explosion at Abbey Gate.
And do you guys have like an operations center that you were working out of? I mean, that's part of the main problem you face is all of these veterans doing all of these different tasks, and you guys kind of brought them together. Was there like an actual physical place to work out of and take those phone calls? How were you guys doing this?
No, it was completely distributed. And I think that's one of the things I was most proud of with our veteran population. Well, first of all, there were also a lot of active duty guys from like the SEALs teams and the SF guys and Ranger Regiment who were working in their day rooms. They had set up, like ad hoc. So they did have that. They had little operation centers that were completely ad hoc. Third group brought in cots and they were actually rotating and hot bunking through I think it was like a day room, where they were, but for guys like me, I mean, I live in Tampa. I was working on signal here in my office where I teach leadership. And then, at my house, we had a double amputee Green Beret who was, he's an executive at a sawmill, was going into the break room, would roll into the break room and was working it there. And I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book Pineapple Express was that I didn't feel like those stories of the volunteers who were working, like sitting at a breakfast table with their kids, facilitating the movement of a commando partner and his wife as they were like getting beaten at a checkpoint, and talking in real time to a guy you had fought alongside saying, Steve, they're beating my wife. Should I stay or should I run? And you're sitting there giving that real time and your kid is sitting there eating breakfast, so there was no formal aspect to this at all. It was a crap show. And I think anything that is conveyed differently, for at least for us, would be disingenuous. We were out over our skis from the time it started.
It's pretty amazing to think about that. You said the book Pineapple Express, is that out yet?
It is. It's Operation Pineapple Express. It came out on the anniversary. And I wrote the whole thing. I didn't want it to be like this one time at band camp, like a memoir, because it's not. I mean, it's just not. I mean, it was really. I wrote it in third person, and what it does, Congressman, is it toggles between various Afghan characters like Hasina Safi, the Minister of Women's Affairs. Mm-hmm. She was the most wanted woman in Afghanistan after Ghani's wife left, and she moved through our little network. She's going. The Minister of Women's Affairs is wading through a sewage canal with her family in tow. And she's terrified of soldiers because the Russians had tried to kill her dad, and that's when they went into Pakistan. And so what she's going through is she's moving through this canal and then ultimately comes across this 82nd Airborne First Sergeant who's like 6'20", and she's terrified of soldiers, and he ends up pulling her out. And she said in her interview with me, she said, when I went into that sewage ditch, I had 4 brothers, and when I came out, I had 5. And they're still in touch today. They're still connected. We did a Zoom call with her and the paratroopers from the White Devils.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, man, that for me was the most astounding thing, was this level, this depth of relationship and connection that was in place and that sprung forward in this really dark period. It was astounding.
Is there, you guys do a lot of tracking of the folks you got out and what happened to them afterwards?
We try, there's some of that goes on for a lot of the guys, because this has really devastated the veteran community, that certainly those that were involved in it. Mm-hmm. So helping with resettlement is a really good way to move through, I think, the moral injury of it. For example, Nizam is right here in Riverview with us. He lives just down the road. He works in our nonprofit with us. He just got a great job. He's got his GED now. So, we track that and we sponsor his family. But I will say for others, Congressman, it's not as good a story, because there was such an influx mm-hmm. of refugees during that period that most of the veterans were facing towards Kabul. And so they weren't looking what came behind them. And now we have this other resettlement situation on our hands. So it's not as coherent as I wish it could be.
Yeah. And I mean, you guys can't do everything. Our government has the resources to do this. And I'll get to that and kind of the policy of Afghanistan. I do want to chat with you about that after we sort of illuminate what this operation was. Maybe one of my last questions on it is, once our last soldier, once our last plane was out of there, was that end mission for you guys, or were you then looking for other ways to get folks out? And when we say, our Afghan partners, are we only referring to commandos, or you're talking about interpreters as well? Were there U.S. citizens involved in Pineapple Express? Was it just kind of, I assume that it's sort of the veteran community coming together, and it's like, look, these are the people we know of. I mean, I assume that's what it is. I assume it's like, no, we only do commandos, right? It's anybody you can.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you took a poll during that 96-hour period of what Afghans would like to leave Afghanistan, it would be pretty close to 100%. I mean, there was very few. And so what we were focused on, though, primarily were the Afghan Special Operations partners, because they're not eligible for a special immigration visa because they technically didn't work for the U.S. government. They worked for, the Afghan government. But they were, in our assessment, completely abandoned in a way that all of their mechanisms for resistance and everything was completely compromised. Yeah. And they were hunted almost immediately. And so that was our focus. Now, we also helped interpreters. We helped, like I said, a lot of at-risk women. And it was kind of crazy the way that different groups came together that would never, ever work together. And even when you and I were in Afghanistan, groups that we would not have worked with or even known about. Yeah. Because of the necessity and the level of duress, they started to come together. But so yes, we helped orphans and everybody, all the groups were doing some version of that. But our focus was primarily on the Afghan Special Operations Forces, who we knew, who we could vet, and who we could responsibly present to the paratroopers at that 4-foot hole in the fence, so that they knew they were pulling through highly vetted individuals and their families.
Yeah. Yeah. And so once that last plane left, was there any hope of getting some of these guys out anymore?
Yeah. So to that question, when the bomb went off, it was catastrophic for obviously the Afghans and those 13 service members that lost their lives, but it was also, I think, for the veteran population, and not a lot of people talk about this, but that had really leaned into this hard, and all of a sudden now all of those people that we were trying to get out couldn't. They were stuck, and most of us knew immediately that was it. There was no more NEO. There was no more non-combatant evacuation. That was over. Yeah. And then we all had to kind of ask ourselves, now what? Are we gonna stay in this thing for the long game? There were a few of us who were actually invited to the Pentagon by General Milley to try to do a private-public partnership, like with DOD and state, and I signed on to do it along with a handful of other volunteers. What I will tell you, 1 year plus later, not so much. What this has been for a year has been private groups of veterans cashing in their checking accounts and their kids' savings funds to pay for safe houses, medical care. There's been it's been an unbelievable effort on the part of the veteran population to sustain because the way we felt, Congressman, was these people that were on our manifests didn't get out, and now they're going to be hunted. They can't go home. They really, there's no recourse for them at all, and they're about to go through winter. So try telling any of these individuals that had served alongside these folks that, hey, you just need to hang up the phone, like we did what we could. So what ended up happening was mostly private efforts to sustain these individuals through the winter. Some people got out, but honestly, it's a trickle now. Very few people are going to get out. But these groups, we just met with them here in my office, 20 volunteer groups called Moral Compass. And what we met on was actually the mental health and moral injury of our Afghan war population right now as a result of this thing. And it is not good.
And if people want to, no veteran should be mortgaging their house or refinancing their house to do this. There's probably plenty of people who would donate funds to it. Where could people help?
Well, for example, we started a nonprofit on top of the nonprofit we already had to work with veterans, and it's called operelief.org. People can go there and they can donate, and 100% of the proceeds goes to Afghans in duress. But let's not forget, I'm just going to be pretty candid. As soon as that bomb went off and we moved into the Ukraine focus, not too many people cared about Afghanistan, and the donor base went to zero.
Yeah. And it's not surprising. I'm in politics, so I'm public relations constantly. So I'm well aware of the attention span of the public.
Yeah, you get it more than most.
And the attention span of the public's is starting to move away from Ukraine too. We are incapable of focusing. And it's frustrating to guys, veterans who do focus, right? Whose job it is to focus on a particular problem set over a long period of time.
Can I share this with you real quick, Congressman? Just to your point, is we interviewed a guy named George out of Fayetteville, North Carolina. He fifth group guy, fought in Vietnam. He's 84 years old, and he is still pulling Montagnards out and resettling them in rural North Carolina. Been doing it for decades, and it's almost the same thing though, the way that went down with his partner force and the Montagnards. And I asked him, I said, how long are you going to do this? And he said, till I'm dead, and he's not alone. There's a lot of SF generation Vietnam generation SF guys that are doing the exact same thing these veterans are doing, and they've been doing it for years, and they're not going to stop.
That is kind of a difference. The SEALs and SF, we're all under SOCOM, and we all have the same, technically the same mission sets, but Green Berets definitely train a lot more for the kind of unconventional warfare by, with, and through capability, this building up of a surrogate force, this long-term relationship building with surrogate forces. It's certainly a mission set within the SEAL teams, but we're a lot more direct action, maritime focused.
Right.
And so explain to people what that is, this by, with, and through, this unconventional warfare, and maybe a better way than even I can.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and there is a lot of confusion around it. But the charter for U.S. Army Special Forces, who really draw their origins from World War II with the Office of Strategic Services, comes from a period of time when in World War II, these small groups of advisors would parachute into Nazi-occupied Europe, and they would work with partisans. They would work with people in France and other countries who were resisting or willing to resist. And Green Beret, or these individuals, would speak the language. They had combat skills training, but they were teachers. They were training. They were advising. And that parlayed into the establishment of U.S. Army Special Forces in the 1950s. And really ever since then, there have been, it's only about 6,500 of them in the inventory, but their whole focus is to build capacity from the inside out to stand up. What I kind of tell people is, as you said, every special operator is different, But if I was going to kind of give a modern characterization of a Green Beret, it's like a combination of, John Wick, Lawrence of Arabia, and the Verizon guy. It's relationship-based connectors who have lethality, but they don't lead with that lethality as a general rule, as opposed to surgical strike forces like in the outfit that you ran with. And what you're going to see typically a Green Beret do is to try to build social capital or relationships in low trust areas, and then train those individuals, mobilize those individuals, and then put them into play at scale. And so that's what we've been doing for years, and certainly what we did with our Afghan partners, over the 20-year war.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different iterations and versions of this. And again, SEALs, MARSOC, Green Beret, we're kind of all doing the same thing. We were interchangeable according to SOCOM as far as which missions to do. There's maybe some preferential mission tasking every once in a while, but in Iraq, we were partnered with a force. It would be a different force depending on where you were stationed. Sometimes it was military, sometimes it was actually police units. You help them with the targeting and even the court cases, as that war matured, and then just went alongside them on a more of a direct action capture mission. Afghanistan was quite different, especially by the time I deployed there in 2012. So we were doing the VSO mission, which obviously I'm sure you're familiar with. I don't know what your history is in special forces or when you got out, but I'm sure you're familiar with the VSO mission, and started around 2010, I believe. And the whole point of this was very much kind of this old school Green Beret mission set, where we're going to live in the village, and we're going to establish those relationships and try to work with civil affairs. We're working on projects, etc. Like I suppose in a way, the word nation building is like a super bad connotation, and I get and understand why, but I also don't like oversimplifying things. This stuff's complex.
Sure.
And then we in the SEAL teams, we had the commando mission. So we would travel all over the province in Kandahar, kind of to different VSOs, and seeing how they were doing. So they were doing a lot less of like patrolling out and getting into gunfights. They might be attacked every once in a while, but they weren't looking for fights. That was our job. And, it worked out okay. It's not sustainable though, because as soon as we left, that power vacuum is not filled by the people we want to fill it, and thus the story of the Afghan war for 20 years basically. So I'll just let you. I didn't really ask you a question, but I don't know.
No, it's interesting when talking about VSO. On my third tour over Afghanistan,
I didn't say what VSO even meant. Village Stability Operations. So that's for people wondering. Yeah. So actually, when I went over to Afghanistan in 2010 for my third tour, my last tour, I was one of the guys who helped stand up the VSO mission, and so I'm very, very familiar with it, with the methodology, and really, Congressman, it was really based on, and I'm sure you know this, is remote area foreign internal defense was what Green Berets and other special operators were doing with the Montagnards and other indigenous people in the central highlands of Vietnam. And there's actually a lot of precedent for this approach in undergoverned at-risk areas as a component of this kind of work. And the whole deal behind the village stability thing was that this was a long game type thing, and that most of Afghanistan is an informal civil society. It is remote. It is tribal, and building capacity out there for locals to stand up on their own over time. And you're talking about and we said this is a multi-decade endeavor. This is, we've been in Colombia for 50 years doing this kind of FID. This is probably twice that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And look, it gets to a broader strategic discussion about like, what were we doing there? We're just endless wars. And, this became a very obsessive slogan. This is obviously one of my pet peeves. I write about this a lot. I debate it a lot because look, I mean, what I point out to people is, look, on day one, we got attacked. On day two, we all decided that we would go. There was like one member of Congress that said no. Everybody was on board. You said, let's go kick their ass. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Like that's indisputable. But then people want to kind of change their minds. Okay. So day three is, all right, we kicked their ass. Now what? Do we Do we pull back and let them reestablish themselves and potentially inflict another attack? Or do we try to create a situation over there where it's a hell of a lot less likely that we have another 9/11? And so the nation chose, and under George Bush, we chose to stay there and try to create a situation where we don't have another 9/11. Now, unfortunately, I don't think everybody had ever explained it in the terms that I just explained it.
Right.
And so therefore we had this just very dishonest and impatient political conversation for years and years and years. And it ended up in this. And it's extremely frustrating to veterans, I think.
It really is. And, you know, I when I wrote the book, Congressman, I interviewed a lot of veterans, and you probably know quite a few of them, and, you know, some pretty iconic NCOs in particular, you know. And what really struck me was that on the other side of this thing, and it wasn't just Afghan veterans, by the way, either, it included Iraq War veterans as well, was the level of where these individuals are in terms of how they view their leadership right now, how they view how this thing was handled in the context of the youth that they gave to this war and what they thought they were doing and what actually happened. It's not good. I mean, it is a level of betrayal in terms of the way this went down. I've never seen it in my life. And again, I know it's a little bit anecdotal, but there are also studies coming out right now that have got some very concerning numbers where like 73% of Afghan war veterans feel betrayed by what happened on this thing. So I don't know what that means long term, but I do think that there is a level of veteran disposition and health on this that we've got to look at. I'm really concerned about it. I think that what's going to come out of this is we haven't seen it yet.
That's why, after this happened, we don't need any numbers to tell us that that's how people are going to feel. Of course, that's how they're going to feel. And one of the things I said was like, look, that it does feel right now like it was all for nothing. Like your friends you lost, or maybe you lost some limbs, or maybe you have permanent brain damage. Now you feel like it was for nothing because of the way we left, and literally put it right back into the same situation that it was in before 9/11.
Right.
But I always have to remind people it still is not for nothing, because people are like, what do we get for 20 years of war and trillions of dollars? Well, you got no more 9/11s, so yeah, that's not nothing. That is significant. The war on terror was taking the fight to the enemy, and people like Tucker Carlson will sort of brush that aside, like, nah, unfortunately, this has become like the populist right's favorite talking point. Not even the left's, but it's very frustrating. But I'm like, no, there was still something to it. Like, we have to be honest about the complexities of this. Go ahead.
I agree, and I think that the capabilities that were put in place as well. My personal position on this, because I've continued to talk to the Afghan commandos and special ops and a lot of folks who are still in country. And what I would say, to take your argument a step further, even, is I think that perhaps the greatest contributions of our men and women that fought over there for 20 years haven't been realized yet. I think it might quite possibly manifest in the follow-on actions of all of these commandos, of the 8 million young people who went to school, of women who had 20 years of a lived experience that is not what they're experiencing right now, particularly Hazara and Tajik women. So I don't. It's kind of like T.E. Lawrence said, nothing is written, and I don't think that we've seen the end of this yet. And I'm like you. I think certainly the preemption of another 9/11 over a 20-year span. But also, I think creating a potential antibody to violent extremism in that part of the world, that even despite our best efforts of abandonment, might still happen.
Well, that's not something I had considered. That's an excellent point, I think, to bring forth. It doesn't, none of these points we're making forgive some of the actions over the years. And maybe I want to talk about that for a second, because the other, and again, I think people are just mad. And when people are mad, they'll blame as many other people as they can find. Again, I'm in politics. I see it all the time.
Yeah.
Very, very, very emotional. Like guys like you, like I'm not an emotional person. And so like, I don't understand people's emotions sometimes. But I do observe it very closely. And that's sort of what happens. And when people ask like, well, who should we blame? Should we hold Milley accountable and the military leaders and they lied to and all the military industrial complex? And nobody knows what they mean by that. But I was like, well, you should hold Biden accountable. He's literally the one person who decided to do this. The military told him not to do this, just to be clear. But then people go back in time a little bit and make arguments about the general military leadership over the years. And there's probably a little bit more something to that argument. And as far as what could have been done better. Was there a complacency that set in? Was it this just says, hey, here's my tour. I'm going to have some metrics that I look at on an Excel document, and then I'm going to express that in a PowerPoint, and I will get my next star. There's that kind of frustration. You certainly hear that kind of thing, definitely from our lower ground troops who were there. That's the sense they get. I'm curious what your sense of that is, and how much of it is true. I'm still inclined to blame politicians more than anything else, because in the end, the military just follows orders. And you can say that the generals should have revolted, should have given better advice. I don't know. In the end, so I am torn on that particular subject. Curious what your thoughts are.
Well, it's a great question, and I hit this really hard in my epilogue, and it was really the only place that I came out of third person voice, and because there are some things that I feel pretty strongly about. I tend to agree that the political decision that was made by this administration to leave the way we did, they own it, and they're going to own it, not just for the impact on our veterans and the Afghans, but also I think what's going to happen if we allow Afghanistan to continue to evolve and reemerge as a playground for not just AQ, but I think you're going to see ISIS right now reemerging there. So that is not written either, is what was made possible in terms of the global projection of a 2.0 violent extremist capability that we're seeing right now is manifesting. So we got
98 people on the terrorist watch list coming across our southern border just this year, and that's just the ones we track.
That's right, and there's Osama bin Laden's son is in Afghanistan right now. Gee, I wonder why. I mean, like, what could he? I mean, just hanging out. I mean, those kinds of, and we're not talking about it. There's reporting that ISIS Maine has moved their headquarters from Syria to Afghanistan. I mean, and this is all coming from commandos, SF guys, guys on the ground. So I think that's one thing that I really believe there needs to be accountability. I personally hope, as a veteran and a citizen, that we see more public hearings on this.
Oh, there will be a lot
on what happened in Afghanistan, because that, to your point, there's multiple administrations and multiple senior leaders. This needs to be unpacked if we're going to continue to prosecute wars through partners, through surrogates. We've got to kind of get to this, because we're getting this multi-generational systemic abandonment reputation going all the way back to the Montagnards. And it's getting to a point where a young Green Beret or a young SEAL is going to go into a low trust area to try to build a relationship, and they're not going to have any social capital to use.
Exactly.
And then the final thing I would say is I am pretty hard in the epilogue on senior military officers in relation to the abandonment. And particularly, I'm hard on the Special Forces community, because I feel like there's no reason that we shouldn't have had at least a couple of 12-man ODAs on the ground in the final months leading up to this that would have at least helped our residual forces survive and resist. And we didn't do that. And that's our job. That's what we're supposed to be the best in the world at. Now, I know we can talk all the policy reasons and being told to sit down in color, but we didn't do that on 9/12/2001 when we wanted to get in the game and do UW. We found a way to get in. So anyway, that's where I stand on it.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And in the end, I don't even know the answer, because I don't know if they tried and were shot down by the White House. I just don't know.
I don't know,
because the thing is the previous administration was also very keen on getting out too. Trump was just talked out of it every day. And, to his credit, I think he listened to people, and they're like, this will happen if you do this, and you're not going to like the political results. And he's like, okay, fine, we won't do it. Biden had a completely different take on it. And, in the end, I don't know. And in hindsight is a bit 2020 on this. And it just, I don't even know what the right answer is on our 20-year strategy. It's, I do think in the future we have to decide. We're either going to punish, like, that's the question. Are you punishing your enemy, or are you going to create an insurance policy that ensures that the enemy doesn't come back? And our general strategy over the last 20 years is try to create an insurance strategy. But that insurance strategy is, again, we have a short attention span in this country. We're very impatient. We're already impatient with Ukraine, even though they're kicking ass, which is like, I mean, it kind of blows my mind. It's like, talk about a good investment, but like our public is that's really not fair. It's a very loud minority of our public that's increasingly frustrated and impatient, and we're not even losing anyone. So this is the American way to an extent, and it's politically difficult. Multiple presidents, Obama, Trump, Biden, promised to get us out of these conflicts. And I just don't think it's an honest conversation. I think this stuff's just complicated and should have been expressed as such.
Well, to your point, I mean, if we're going to go and build an antibody to either a near peer or violent extremists or both, then we have to have the intellectual honesty from the policy level all through the generals down to the guys that have to do it. We have to have the intellectual honesty to talk about what that means. What does it mean to go and do that? Because that is a long-term endeavor. It is the long game. It requires, frankly, the responsible coordination, which is almost laughable to me, of multiple administrations to keep that going over the spectrum of engagement. And we need to set it up at that policy level for it to happen. If every time we go into a place like this and we say that we want to build capacity, but yet every task force commander, fractures the Taliban, and, this thing is expected to be wrapped up by each administration's end game, then we're just not only are we setting ourselves up for failure, but we're setting ourselves up for this kind of wholesale abandonment and this kind of damage to our veteran population who did what they were supposed to do. And that's where I would really like to see not blame, but accountability. Like, what are we doing to address these systemic issues and get better at it as a nation? I don't know. I think we owe our veterans that.
Yeah, and it's hard to write a playbook for what that antibody mission looks like, because it's very different in Iraq than Afghanistan. Iraq is easier in many ways, just geographically. It just pure geographics. It's just easier. A lot of sectarian issues, of course. But times 20 or 100 in Afghanistan as far as tribalism and sectarianism. Iraq being a much more modern place, so that we did kind of have Iraq sort of buttoned up by the time of my last deployment in 2010, and it didn't mean that it was safe enough to leave. Obviously, that was a foolish decision, and anyone could have told you all the bad guys were waiting in Syria just to pummel the country again. But the capacity building had worked, right? You had created a stable ally, which is not a bad thing to have in a country next door to Iran. Should we have gone to Iraq in the first place? That's a different question. Hindsight's 2020. I am much more sympathetic to people who are against that than I am to people who are against Afghanistan. Two very, very different reasons for going in. But in the end, we were in, and so the question is, what do you do? But Afghanistan's a very different kind of region, very, very mountainous, very rural. And it felt like you were going back into the biblical ages every time I spent the night in some kind of random village out in the middle of nowhere. It's very different than Iraq. And so, there was some experts who would have said that, like, look, you can never actually tame the countryside of Afghanistan. Cities are a different story. I mean, they have large buildings, there's casinos, there's roads. Like, it is a city. With city-like people, very, very different kind of mentality. And that's sort of what we ended up on. We sort of ended up in this place after many years where we have very few troops on the ground, where we've stabilized it at a low boil, and it was sustainable, not very low cost to us. Why we left is crazy, but it's important that people understand how that transition happened and kind of the lessons learned, and the fact that it's just different no matter where you go, because people in this day and age are looking for very simple answers. They're used to the internet that tells them this is what you need to think right now. Right. And anything beyond that just frustrates people, and stuff's complicated.
It's very complicated. And when I wrote about the Village Stability Program, one of the things that I tried to capture on that in my book, Game Changers, was this, what you just hit on. And it's really important, is civil society in Afghanistan, for example, because we may face this again there or somewhere else. You go 1 mile off the pavement in any direction, and you are in what's called a status society. It is a bottom-up society. It is where, elders, it's an honor-based, shame-based society, and it is a completely different set of operating principles. It does not operate in a top-down fashion. And then you get into Kabul, Kandahar, those places, it's a contract society, which looks more like the government we know and understand. Mm-hmm. And we tried to take that contract society mindset and plant it down in the most remote, rural status society places on earth, the most tribal society on earth. And it was a square peg in a round hole. Yeah. And we tried to do this and it wasn't until 2010 that Green Berets even started to figure this out, mm-hmm. And so we spent a decade, like you said, punishing our enemy, but it really wasn't until midway through the war that we even made the strategic pivot to look out in the rural areas and go, oh man, we should be working from the bottom up also. Mm-hmm. And by then it was, honestly, I think it was too late. But we didn't stay with the program that long. But I do think there's tremendous lessons learned from that we could harvest and consider in our next engagement.
Right. Same with Iraq. I mean, geez, some huge lessons about, expelling the entire Ba'ath Party from the government, and right. And immediately creating like tens of thousands of unemployed, dangerous men. Probably
possibly go wrong.
What could possibly go wrong? In Afghanistan, similarly, and there wasn't anything super complex about village stability operations. It's like, just build relationships, just go there and
that's it.
Build relationships. Let them see that, like, you'll give some medicine to their kids, and like we're not the bad guys, and our friends are the Afghan government, who should eventually be the governing force here within reason, right? Within their own culture, like it. Yeah. So, but like you said, that 10 years later, and by, it's important to note that by 2010 too, I mean, the Taliban had matured their own fighting tactics. And so absolutely very difficult to deal with that. They've got kind of shadow governance everywhere. They operate in the shadows. They can move freely between, wherever we were working and Pakistan. Became a very difficult enemy to fight, because they'd been they'd adapted and regrouped over the course of many years. And it would have taken many more years of VSO operations to deal with that. Oh yeah. And it's not clear that, I totally get it when guys are like, okay, but like, why? I mean, I get that. And, because we go outside of our compound and our feet get blown off, at least in certain areas. Yeah. And, it's hard for your ground soldiers to see the point of that, which speaks to a lack of leadership in the military about why are you doing what you're doing. It might actually matter quite a bit. I mean, I can make the strategic arguments, but you better make that very, very clear to the guys. Right. And I'm not sure that happened, and so it's not surprising that anxiety filled that void, and we changed tactics pretty wildly just a few years later. Oh.
Well, that lack of clarity is definitely there now.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
that's
wow.
For sure.
Yeah.
What's your take? Do you guys have any operations at all or anything related to Ukraine?
A lot of our folks in Pineapple have pivoted into the Ukraine effort. Some people are in Ukraine, doing humanitarian work. I think there's a real, I don't know, Congressman, I think there's something about the generation of warfighters that you and I come from that maybe we're still figuring this out right now. But I was just in here, like I said yesterday, with 20 volunteer groups, and we were talking about this and how fast veterans jumped into the fray in Afghanistan and pivoted even faster into the Ukrainian effort to help with, with humanitarian things. And there is, I believe, a real deep, and I think all veterans have this, but I just think it's very pronounced and fresh with our generation of spending, 20 years at war, is there's just this deep sense of personal responsibility and higher purpose that a lot of them have, and trying to figure out what to do with that when you leave the military is not an easy thing.
No, that's exactly right.
And I think that's what we're seeing in a lot of these cases. I'm not involved with Ukraine that much, simply because I'm not good enough to be that spread out. I need to focus on one thing in this case, and my focus is on Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, it's I'm curious what your thoughts are, and try to put you on the spot there, but I figure you have thoughts on general.
Well, I do.
The Ukraine war and where it's going.
Real quick, I would just say that I was just talking off camera that I think the resistance in Ukraine is amazing. I am astounded at the coherence and efficiency of this resistance effort. I've never seen anything like it. The whole of government, whole of nation approach to this, from Zelensky all the way down, the way that it's it's clear that the resistance operating concept was in play there, but the level of pre-work that's gone into this, I mean, just as a UW guy, I'm really impressed. And frankly, I think, as you said, I think the return on investment for this, in terms of what we're buttressing up against and what we're pushing back on, to me is a no-brainer. It really is. I guess I'm just a little confused as to why we can't put some measure of that kind of support into the Afghan resistance or to the Afghan commandos. Like, I mean, is it just Ukraine where we do this? Like, and I can't reconcile that in my brain. It doesn't. We have a 20-year partner that we bailed on, but yet we have this effort over here where seems to be going well and we're kind of doing the right things, but can we walk and chew gum at the same time?
Well, I mean, it gets to this broader political conversation about the exhaustion Americans feel with any kind of foreign policy, and that isolationist streak, where, and here's what isolationism appears to me to attach moral value to non-intervention, like simply for the sake of non-intervention. Now, it can be a moral value if intervention is harming our national security, or is backfiring, or is not in our national interest. It's just a waste. But you can't just apply that reasoning to everything, I mean, because they literally do. And so it's because it's really hard to look at the Ukraine situation and say, we're not getting a good return on investment. Like, you got to be really dishonest about what's happening there, because the numbers don't lie, the actions don't lie. They keep saying we're drawing ourselves into a war. That would have happened by now, guys. Like, I mean, let's be honest. It would have happened by now. Right. It doesn't mean you can't go too far, and you could do that, but we still no indication of that happening. So the arguments just fall flat. And that tendency by the isolationists, where you can't find one foreign policy they're in favor of. So again, it's any intervention is immoral in their eyes. Any meddling is immoral, even if it has pretty clearly direct positive consequences for our national interests, such as creating resistance against the Taliban that would therefore eliminate the possibility of another safe haven for terrorist attacks, at a fairly low cost. And so there's just a totally different mindset, Scott.
I deal with. I've never, with the whole isolationist thing in the times that we live in, I've always found it to be a little bit diluted in terms of like what, and just from a practical sense. For example, if you take even a little bit of time as a layman to understand the enduring narrative of groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS, if you just look at what they exist to do, what their enduring charter is, and their level of persistence and motivation to follow through on that, to strike our homeland, not just strike our homeland, but I mean, look at the apocalyptic view of ISIS and what they want the end of days approach that they want to usher in. And it is a relentless, they've got all the time in the world. And to me, to sit there and look at a place like Afghanistan, where we already have, a precedent setting event like 9/11, where we know that groups like this are going to use that sanctuary to do that. And now we've got reporting coming off the battlefield to these volunteer groups in droves that is telling us it could possibly be a worse disposition than pre 9/11. And to not consider that, and that the enemy has a vote in what comes to us, and just sticking to this, I don't know. It just, in terms of what happened over the last 20 years, I can't reconcile it. It's hard for me to swallow, and I get the moral implications of it, but just from a practicality perspective, it's to me, it's diluted.
And it's naive. It's probably it's naive. It's built upon frustration, and anything built upon an emotion like frustration is, it's not guaranteed to have a logical framework associated with it. And naivete is, I think, the best way to describe that state of mind, because it wrongly assumes that we live in a very, very large world, and we don't live in a large world. This war in Ukraine is a 12-hour flight at most, maybe less. Afghanistan ain't that much further. So
No.
the world is small, and you can choose to believe that or not, but it is a fact. And I tell people all the time, you can write a fiction, go write a nice fiction story about the world you think should be, right? Where everybody sort of leaves each other alone. We all manufacture our own stuff, and there's limited interaction, limited needs for interaction. Go write that fiction. It is a fiction. And some of us have to choose to live in the real world, even if that disabuses some of some convenient narratives that they like to spin.
I think the isolationist argument lost its mettle when we stopped moving in wooden ships.
That's basically right. That's basically what I'm saying. It took 6 months or whatever to get across the Atlantic. It's not the same.
Kind of made sense. That kind of made sense, but I just don't think it's not tenable.
No, it's not. And it's extreme. Like, because I don't think there's actually any such thing as an interventionist. Like they would call me that, right? They call me all sorts of names, but I'm not an interventionist. I don't attach moral value to intervention. I just simply ask questions like, does this have some value for us? And then we answer that question. We move accordingly. Stuff's not that complicated, but I think we've beat that dead horse a little bit. And I've run out of time anyway. I got to move on to we got another podcast to record. Scott, this is it's been fascinating talking to you, and I want to thank you, personally for help. I bet you guys got people out that I personally worked with.
I'm sure of it, Congressman, and I'm dear friends with Mike Waltz, and I really, really appreciate. I know that you moved a lot of stuff around to make this happen, and I just appreciated it because it's given a voice to a lot of our veteran population that's hurting right now. I hope you get a chance I think I sent you the book. I hope you get a chance to give it a look when you get some time. I know you don't have much time, but it's great meeting you.
No, Scott, that was amazing. Thank you for being on. Say the name of your most recent book and your past book you wrote as well, so the audience can get that if they want.
Yeah, so all the talk we were doing about Afghanistan and VSO, if you're interested in that, Game Changers, I wrote this way back in 2014, but it's going local to defeat violent extremists. And it's all the lessons learned that went into this that were really derived from the Vietnam fight and then manifested over in Afghanistan. And it's just kind of a primer on how we approached that, the mistakes we made and what we might learn. And then my recent book is Operation Pineapple Express. And it's all about the recovery that folks did to try to get our Afghan partners out. And I hope people will pick it up. It's a pretty powerful read, and it really tells the story that frankly hasn't been told about what happened kind of behind the scenes with these volunteer groups.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and people stayed up countless hours, put countless amount of effort into doing it. So thank you for that, Scott. It was a pleasure talking to you.
You too, Congressman. Thanks for everything.